It was the cultural earthquake that grossed a staggering $600 million, becoming one of the most profitable films in history. In 1972, Deep Throat shattered every taboo with Hollywood's elite from Jack Nicholson to Jackie Kennedy, lining up to witness the birth of its overnight sensation, Linda Lovelace. To the world, she was the face of the sexual revolution, a liberated woman enjoying her newfound stardom. But behind that infamous smile lay a high-security biological prison. This wasn't a career, it was a human trafficking operation enforced by a literal gun to her head. While the world celebrated her freedom, Linda was a captive surviving a nightmare of hypnotic control and physical brutality. Today we peel back the Deep Throat myth to reveal the 100% uncovered timeline of Linda's 17-day torture, the $250 betrayal, and the forbidden secret she took to her grave. In 1972, the cultural geography of the United States was undergoing a seismic, visceral transformation. The neon-lit streets of Manhattan's Times Square became the laboratory for an experiment in mainstream depravity that the media rebranded as porno chic. At the center of this hurricane was a $25,000 production that would eventually rewrite the forensic ledgers of the film industry. Deep Throat was not merely a movie, it was a cultural seizure that transformed Linda Lovelace from an anonymous girl from Florida into a global icon of the sexual revolution. In the cold accounting of Hollywood's history, this era represents the deceptive peak of the sin wave, a billion-dollar facade built on a foundation of absolute human liquidation. The financial miracle of Deep Throat remains one of the most staggering anomalies in the history of global capitalism. Produced on a threadbare budget of $22,500, the film successfully bypassed the traditional barriers of the adult industry to infiltrate the highest echelons of society. It generated a staggering estimated gross of $600,000,000. In the professional analysis of return on investment, this was an unprecedented industrial triumph. The film was screened at high-end venues where celebrities and socialites rubbed shoulders, turning a low-budget illicit project into a cultural requirement. The Hollywood Reporter summarized this atmospheric rise with a chilling professional enthusiasm. From a $22,000 budget to a $600 million empire, the Linda Lovelace story is the ultimate American dream. To the public, Linda Lovelace was the triumphant Joan of Arc of this new era. Her face was plastered on the covers of major magazines, her smile a standardized symbol of a woman who had finally claimed her own autonomy. The critical establishment in New York provided the intellectual lubrication for this exploitation, elevating the film to the status of a masterpiece. One prominent New York critic in 1972 wrote, "Deep Throat is more than a movie. It is a cultural revolution, and Linda Lovelace is its Joan of Arc." This high art validation allowed the public to ignore the corporeal reality of what was happening behind the lens. The world believed they were witnessing the birth of a superstar, a woman who was reaping the rewards of a billion-dollar legacy. The celebrity endorsement of the film added a layer of platinum-plated legitimacy to the exploitation. Icons like Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty were seen at screenings, lending their S-class status to a production that was in reality a crime scene. Nicholson perfectly captured the peer pressure of the era when he remarked, "Everyone was talking about it. You weren't in unless you had seen Linda." The glamour of Hollywood's elite functioned as a social quarantine, shielding the public from the dark pharmaceutical reality of Linda's daily existence. In a public interview in 1972, Linda herself delivered the industry-mandated narrative masking her trauma with a forced practice charm. "I'm just a girl who happened to become a star. It's been a whirlwind of glamour." It was a lie engineered by her captors to ensure the $600 million dividends continued to flow. Gerard Damiano, the director who successfully converted a woman's degradation into high art, viewed the production through a purely clinical lens. He saw Linda not as a victim, but as a high-performance instrument. Damiano's professional assessment of her talent was rooted in a total lack of empathy for her physical toll. Linda was a natural. She had a smile that told the world she loved every second of it. This was the diabolical genius of the 1972 phenomenon. The industry had successfully commodified a woman's fear and rebranded it as pleasure. The public was paying $600 million to watch a woman survive while believing they were watching her celebrate. Behind the scenes, the financial forensic reality was a total liquidation of Linda's future. While the film was building a $600 million empire for the mafia-controlled distributors and the shadowy financiers of the New York underworld, the Joan of Arc of the revolution was living in a state of professional slavery. The $600 million in revenue did not reach the star. It flowed into the offshore accounts of the men who owned her. This was the peak of the faded glory illusion, a world of limousines, fur coats, and magazine covers that cost exactly $0 in actual compensation for the woman who provided the likeness. The industry had successfully standardized the Lovelace brand, turning her into a billion-dollar currency, while her actual value to her owners remained that of an expendable asset. As the 1970s moved forward, the public continued to applaud the miracle of Deep Throat, unaware that the sin wave was already beginning its terminal drop. The Cultural Revolution was a heist, and the ultimate American dream was a nightmare being projected on a loop in every theater across the country. The $600 million were secured, the icons were satisfied, and the girl from Florida was about to learn that in the world of porno chic, the only thing more dangerous than being forgotten was being made into a phenomenon. The facade was perfect, the lighting was high definition, but the visceral reality of the $22,500 investment was about to be revealed in a way that would haunt America for decades. The Miami Sun in January 1972 provided a deceptive high-definition backdrop for a 17-day siege that remains the darkest forensic entry in Hollywood's archival history. In the professional ledgers of the film industry, a 17-day shoot is a sprint toward a deadline, but for Linda Borman, it was a high-velocity descent into a pharmaceutical and psychological abyss. While the public eventually saw a tropical paradise filled with laughter and liberation, the visceral reality of the set was that of a high-security containment facility. The sin wave of Linda's existence had abandoned the sunlit heights of her public persona and crashed into a valley of systemic violation where every frame of film was bought with a terrifying human toll. The architect of this 17-day hostage situation was Chuck Traynor, a man who functioned as the ultimate predator-in-chief. In the investigative files of Linda's later testimony, Traynor was revealed not as a husband or a manager, but as a technical operator of human suffering. He utilized a sophisticated regime of physical brutality and hypnotic suggestion to liquidate Linda's autonomy. On the set of Deep Throat, Traynor's directorial tools were not script notes or camera lenses, but a .38 caliber handgun and the threat of permanent erasure. He viewed Linda as a biological asset to be optimized for maximum industrial output, famously remarking to those in his inner circle, "She does what I tell her to do. I own her body and soul." The corporeal truth of the production was hidden behind a thick professional layer of heavy foundation. The makeup artist on set occupied a tragic investigative position in this story. They were the first to witness the physical wreckage of Traynor's regime. Every morning before the cameras rolled, the makeup chair became a site of evidence tampering. Bruises on Linda's neck marks left by the violent grip of a man who demanded absolute submission were meticulously covered to preserve the wholesome icon brand. Linda later described this daily ritual of erasure. "The bruises were everywhere. They used heavy foundation to hide the marks of his hands on my neck. To the boardroom at the studio, these marks were simply a production delay. To the woman in the chair, they were the map of her own destruction." Behind the lens, the atmosphere was one of calculated terror. A camera operator on the set provided a chilling, omniscient perspective on the performance that captivated America. He recalled a woman who was frequently on the verge of physical collapse, her biological limits being pushed beyond the threshold of human endurance. He witnessed the silent interrogation that occurred between every take. There were times Linda looked like she was going to faint, but Chuck would whisper something in her ear and she'd start smiling again. This wasn't acting. It was a survival reflex. The smile that the 1972 critics called revolutionary was in fact the terrified expression of a captive looking at a man holding a weapon just out of the camera's frame. The systemic silence of the industry allowed this 17-day siege to continue without intervention. Gerard Damiano, the director who would eventually take credit for the film's artistic vision, was fully aware of the atmospheric friction, but chose to prioritize the $600 million potential over the woman's survival. Damiano's professional detachment is a masterclass in industrial complicity. Looking back at the tension on set, he admitted, "I saw the tension, but in this business you don't ask questions as long as the film is rolling." This cold, hard accounting of the production meant that as long as the 35mm film was capturing usable footage, the visceral cost to the lead actress was considered a negligible overhead expense. Nightfall brought no reprieve. The 17 days were a continuous cycle of assault and coerced labor. Linda was subjected to nightly beatings, a strategy designed to ensure her total compliance for the following day's shoot. She was forced to perform acts that exceeded the physiological boundaries of the human body, all while being reminded that her life depended on the quality of her performance. The sin wave had reached its most stagnant, lethal point. The woman who was supposed to be the queen of the revolution was in reality a $1 million victim being liquidated for the sake of a mafia-funded venture. In the decades that followed, when the porno chic era had faded into a dark historical footnote, Linda Borman would finally provide the forensic autopsy of the film that ruined her life. She stripped away the Technicolor lies to reveal the 17-day crime scene. When you see that movie, you are watching a woman being raped. There is a gun to my head just off camera. This statement remains the definitive indictment of the 1972 phenomenon. It reveals that Deep Throat was not a movie about a woman's pleasure, but a documentary of her incarceration. As the 17-day siege in Miami came to a close, the industry had successfully harvested the footage it needed to build a $600 million empire. The film was in the can, the mafia was preparing for a windfall, and the Lovelace brand was ready for its global debut. But the woman behind the brand had been professionally and physically hollowed out. She had survived the Hong Sung barrel of the gun, but she was about to enter a new kind of prison, a world where her trauma was celebrated as art, and her survival was called a whirlwind of glamour. The sin wave was poised for its next deceptive rise, but the corporeal reality of the Miami set would remain the forbidden secret that Linda Lovelace would carry as a life sentence. The siege was over, but the liquidation of her soul had only just begun. Behind the neon veneer of New York's theater district in the early 70s, a clinical financial heist was underway that would rewrite the forensic ledgers of the American underworld. The $600 million generated by Deep Throat was not merely a box office phenomenon, it was the primary revenue stream for a high-velocity criminal enterprise. In the investigative files of the FBI, the film was identified as a sophisticated money laundering engine for the Colombo crime family, specifically under the direction of the Perrino brothers. To the public, the film represented a breakthrough in cultural freedom, but in the dark reality of the mafia syndicate, the standardized icon, known as Linda Lovelace, was nothing more than a high-yield biological asset, a profitable ghost whose likeness was traded like a commodity in the back rooms of Mulberry Street. The financial forensic contrast of this era represents the most staggering betrayal in the history of global entertainment. While the Colombo family sat on a $600 million legacy, the actual cost of the 17-day production in Miami was paid in the liquidation of Linda's dignity. The professional analysis of her compensation is a masterclass in industrial cruelty. For 17 days of visceral violation and sustained trauma, Linda Borman was paid a total of $1,250. When measured against the estimated gross of the film, the mathematical ratio of her exploitation is a chilling 1 to 480,000. She was the face that built an empire, yet she was effectively a $1 million slave working for a pittance. A legal document from the era later provided a cold architectural assessment of this system. The financial structure of Deep Throat was designed to ensure the talent remained broke and dependent. This dependency was not an accident. It was a calculated strategy of the predator-in-chief Chuck Traynor. Traynor's control over the $1,250 paycheck was absolute. Before the ink was even dry on the studio check, Traynor had seized the funds, ensuring that Linda remained in a state of financial paralysis. Despite being the most famous woman in the universe, she did not have the autonomy to buy a cup of coffee or a meal without the permission of her warden. Traynor's private logic was rooted in a totalizing domestic tyranny. Why should she have money? I provide the house, I provide the food, I provide the fame. To the syndicate, she was a gold mine. To Traynor, she was an expendable tool. Linda later testified to the visceral reality of this theft, stating, "I earned $1,250 for Deep Throat. I never saw a penny of it. Chuck took it all before the ink was dry." The faded glory of the production also ensnared her co-star Harry Reams. While Reams achieved his own level of notoriety and eventually faced federal prosecution for his role in the film, the forensic comparison of their treatment reveals a disturbing gendered hierarchy of power. Reams, though a pawn himself in the syndicate's gamble, possessed a level of social and professional mobility that was denied to Linda. He functioned as a witness to the dangerous atmosphere of the set, observing the long memories of the armed men who patrolled the perimeter. Reams later provided a grim investigative thought on their collective situation. "We were all pawns in a very dangerous game played by men with guns and long memories. Yet even in this shared danger, it was Linda who carried the full human toll of the syndicate's greed." The FBI's later reports on the Colombo family's involvement stripped away the last of the porno chic glamour. Their investigation revealed that the film was a primary revenue stream for organized crime, a billion-dollar venture built on the corporeal sacrifice of a woman who was held in a state of involuntary servitude. The agency's assessment was cold and definitive. Linda Lovelace was their most profitable slave. The $600 million were not spent on artistic innovation or the advancement of social liberty. They were spent on the expansion of criminal influence and the silencing of those who knew the truth. The sin wave of Linda Lovelace's life had now settled into a stagnant financial prison. She was the star of a billion-dollar franchise, yet she was living on a budget of $0. Every magazine cover and every television appearance was a reminder of the million-dollar brand she didn't own. The industry that called her a liberated icon was in reality a syndicate that had successfully liquidated her identity for a $600 million dividend. The betrayal of the $250 paycheck was not just a theft of money, it was a theft of her future. As the 1970s moved toward their conclusion, the mafia continued to harvest the profits of the standardized asset, while Linda remained trapped in the shadows of Chuck Trainor's control. The golden mirage was fading, leaving behind the visceral reality of a woman who had been traded for a billion-dollar box office. The syndicate was satisfied the accountants were finished and the $600 million were safe in the bank. Linda Lovelace was about to learn that in the world of organized crime, the only thing more dangerous than being a victim was being an investment. The sin wave was preparing for its final crash, but the financial wreckage of the $250 betrayal would remain the living evidence of a woman whose soul had been stolen for the price of a used car. At Faded Glories, we remember the cost because the miracle of Deep Throat was a cold-blooded heist of a woman's soul, and the receipts were paid in systemic silence and stolen millions. By the 1980s, the blinding strobe lights of the porno chic era had long since burned out, leaving behind a cold, desolate reality for the woman once known as Linda Lovelace. In a visceral attempt to reclaim her own biological narrative, she shed the stage name that had become a global punchline and emerged as Linda Marciano. The sin wave of her life had not experienced the triumphant recovery the public might have expected. Instead, it had flattened into a grueling daily struggle for survival. In 1980, she published her harrowing memoir, Ordeal, a document that functioned as a forensic autopsy of the 1972 phenomenon. It was the first time the world was forced to confront the forbidden secret that her superstar status was actually a state of involuntary servitude. The publication of Ordeal was not merely a literary event, it was a high-stakes interrogation of a billion-dollar industry. Linda Marciano stripped away the technicolor facade of Deep Throat to reveal a timeline of systematic kidnapping and chemical warfare. However, the forensic reality of the 1980s was one of standardized denial. The adult industry, fearing the liquidation of its most profitable myth, launched a massive campaign to discredit her. Chuck Trainor, the architect of her original trauma, acted as the primary agent of this gaslighting. He dismissed her testimony as a desperate bid for attention, telling the press with a chilling, predatory confidence, "She's lying to sell books. She loved every minute of the fame I gave her." Trainor's narrative was designed to protect the $600 million empire by portraying the victim as a willing participant who had simply grown ungrateful. Despite the industry's attempts to silence her, Linda found a powerful ally in Gloria Steinem and the burgeoning feminist movement. Steinem provided the sociological framework to understand Linda's incarceration, recognizing that her experience was not an isolated scandal, but a systemic crime. In a definitive professional assessment that echoed through the halls of Congress, Steinem declared, "Linda is not a porn star. She is a survivor of a private concentration camp." This was the moment the Faded Glory was subjected to a formal political inquiry. Linda appeared before the Mies Commission, a government body investigating the visceral reality of the sex industry. She sat before the committee and described the gun held to her head just out of frame, a testimony that turned the $600 million gross of Deep Throat into a forensic indictment of American culture. The dollars of this era continued to reflect a staggering financial betrayal. While Linda Marciano was testifying about her psychological and physical destruction, the film Deep Throat continued to circulate in the burgeoning home video market, generating millions of dollars in new revenue for the syndicate that owned it. Linda herself received $0.00 in royalties or restitution. She was a million-dollar victim, living on a poverty-level income, her market value as a human being having been fully harvested by her captors years prior. The 30-year struggle for justice was a masterclass in industrial negligence. The state and the industry were content to keep the profits while leaving the woman who provided the labor to drown in legal fees and medical debts. The psychological toll on her family was the most tragic biological consequence of the empire's greed. Her son later provided a haunting, omniscient perspective on her struggle to find an identity outside of the 1972 frames. My mother spent her whole life trying to run away from a girl named Linda Lovelace. For 30 years, she lived with the visceral reality that her most traumatic moments were being consumed as entertainment by millions. Linda summarized the horror of this persistent liquidation in 1986. Every time someone watches that movie, they are applauding my destruction. The sin wave remained at a terminal low, a state of permanent faded glory, where the icon had become a pariah. The final crash occurred in April 2002. Linda Marciano was involved in a massive high-velocity traffic accident in Denver, Colorado. She died in the hospital a few weeks later at the age of 53. The woman who had survived the barrel of the gun in Miami and the psychological siege of the 70s finally succumbed to a literal physical impact. She died in the same state she had lived in for 30 years, broke, misunderstood, and haunted by the billion-dollar ghost of her former self. The industry she had fought did not attend her funeral. Instead, they continued to sell her likeness, profiting from her death, just as they had profited from her life. The forensic accounting of Linda Lovelace's existence remains the most damning document in the history of Hollywood. Deep Throat grossed an estimated $600 million, cementing its place as a cultural milestone, but the investigative truth is that the only real cost was the soul of the woman who couldn't say no. Every dollar of that empire was a standardized theft of a woman's future. At Faded Glories, we remember the visceral cost because the sexual revolution was built on a foundation of coerced labor and stolen dignity. Linda Lovelace is gone, the syndicate has moved on to new assets, and the millions are safe in offshore accounts. But the forbidden secret is no longer hidden. The faded glory of the 1972 miracle has been replaced by the cold, hard light of a crime scene. As the credits roll on the life of Linda Marciano, we are left with the realization that in a world of manufactured pleasure, the most expensive commodity is a woman's consent. The $600 million were secured, but the woman who paid for them was never truly free until she took her final breath. The sin wave has flatlined, leaving only the truth to witness the cost of the legend.